What happens when a global superstar sits down on live television and the conversation turns into something no one in the studio expected? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The studio lights are bright, the audience is already buzzing, and the camera pans across the table where the hosts are seated, smiling but clearly ready for a serious conversation. The co-hosts exchange quick glances as the guest of the day, Gal Gadot, settles in. There's applause as she waves to the audience, composed, polite, clearly prepared for press questions. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg leans back in her chair, arms crossed in her usual relaxed posture, listening closely. The host begins. Gal, thank you for being here today. We know you've been in the headlines recently, and we appreciate you coming on to talk about it directly. Gal nods. Thank you for having me. I think it's always better to speak openly rather than let speculation do the talking. A small round of applause follows that comment. One of the co-hosts jumps in. There's been a lot of discussion online about comments attributed to you during a recent interview. Some people felt they were misunderstood. Others say they were clear. Do you want to clarify what you meant? Gal takes a breath. Yes, I want to be very clear. My intention was never to dismiss anyone's experiences or perspectives. When you're speaking in a short clip, sometimes context is lost. I believe in dialogue, and I believe in listening. The audience reacts with supportive murmurs. Whoopi leans forward slightly. I hear you, but sometimes context isn't the issue. Sometimes people say exactly what they mean, and the reaction comes from that. So let me ask you directly. Do you feel that criticism was fair? There's a shift in energy. The audience quiets. Gal maintains eye contact. I think criticism is part of being in the public eye. That's something I accept. But I also think it's important that criticism is based on what was actually said, not what people assume was said. A few claps break out. One of the hosts interjects quickly, trying to keep things balanced. So you're saying some of the backlash came from misinterpretation? Yes, Gal replies calmly. And I'm open to discussing that. I just don't want conversations to turn into personal attacks. Whoopi nods slowly. Personal attacks aren't helpful. But when people feel strongly about something, they speak strongly. That doesn't always mean it's an attack. It means they care. The audience reacts with mixed sounds, some applause, some murmurs of agreement. Gal responds, slightly more animated now. I agree people care. And I respect that. But care should also come with responsibility. When millions of people are watching a clip, words matter. There's a pause. The host looks between them. This is exactly the kind of discussion our viewers want. Respectful disagreement. Let's talk about the larger issue. The public reaction seemed very divided. Why do you think that happened so quickly now? Gal gestures lightly with her hands. Social media amplifies everything. A comment can become a headline in minutes. Sometimes the nuance disappears. Whoopi responds immediately. Nuance is important, yes. But sometimes celebrities forget that their platform is part of the power they hold. When you speak, people listen. That responsibility goes both ways. The audience reacts louder this time. Gal nods, not defensive but firm. I completely agree with responsibility. That's why I'm here. I didn't want to avoid questions. I wanted to address them directly. A brief applause. Another co-host jumps in, sensing the conversation building. Some people online said your response felt defensive. How do you respond to that? Gal smiles slightly, acknowledging the tension. I understand that perspective. When something you say is questioned publicly, it can feel personal. But being clear isn't the same as being defensive. It's just clarity. Whoopi leans back again but keeps her eyes on Gal. Clarity is good. But sometimes tone matters just as much as content. People interpret tone differently. The studio is fully engaged now. Gal replies, carefully measured. That's true. And tone can be lost in text or short clips. That's why I value conversations like this. We can look at each other and understand intention. There's applause again, but this time it feels more divided. Some viewers clearly invested in one side, others on the other. The host raises a hand gently. Let me ask something broader. When you see the reaction online, does it affect how you approach interviews in the future? Gal considers this. It makes me more aware. Not fearful, just aware. I think about how things can be interpreted. But I don't want to stop speaking honestly because of that. Whoopi responds immediately. And that's important. Because if people start censoring themselves out of fear, we lose honest conversation. The audience applauds that statement. The tension softens slightly, but there's still a noticeable seriousness in the room. The co-host looks at both women. It seems like what we're really discussing is not just this moment, but how public dialogue works today. Gal agrees. Exactly. It's bigger than one clip. It's about how we communicate. Whoopi nods. And sometimes communication means disagreeing in public. A few audience members cheer. Gal turns slightly toward Whoopi. I'm okay with disagreement. I just want it to remain respectful. Whoopi smiles faintly. Respect goes both ways. The exchange hangs in the air for a moment. It's not explosive, but it's real. The audience senses it. The host quickly transitions, trying to keep momentum. We're going to continue this conversation after the break. When we come back, we'll talk about how public figures handle backlash and whether social media is changing the way talk shows operate. The camera pulls back as the audience applauds again. Gal adjusts her posture slightly, remaining composed. Whoopi glances toward the audience, then back at the table. The energy is steady, not hostile, but undeniably charged. As the show cuts to commercial, the conversation hasn't resolved. It hasn't escalated either. It's in that delicate space live television often captures, where strong personalities, differing viewpoints, and real opinions exist in the same room. And when the cameras return, it will be clear that the discussion is far from over. The cameras return from commercial, and the studio energy feels slightly tighter than before. The audience is still engaged, some leaning forward in their seats. The hosts settle back in, and the main host looks into the camera. We're back with Gal Gadot, and we're continuing our conversation about public reactions, responsibility, and how quickly things spread online. Applause fills the room again, but it's more focused now. Whoopi turns toward Gal. Before the break, we were talking about tone and interpretation. I want to go a little deeper. When you saw the backlash, what was your first reaction, personally? Gal doesn't rush. Honestly, my first reaction was confusion. Not anger. Confusion. Because I felt the message was being reframed in ways I didn't recognize. The audience listens quietly. One of the co-hosts follows up immediately. Did you feel misunderstood? Yes, Gal says. But I also understand that once something is public, people will interpret it through their own experiences. I can't control that. What I can control is how I respond. Whoopi nods thoughtfully. That's fair. But let me ask you something directly. Do you think celebrities sometimes underestimate how much influence they have in shaping conversations? There's a slight pause. The audience seems to sense this is a pivotal moment. Gal responds carefully. I think influence comes with responsibility. I don't underestimate that. But I also think influence shouldn't mean silence. People in public spaces should be able to speak, even if it's imperfect. A few claps break out. Whoopi leans forward, resting her elbows on the table. No one's saying silence. But when your words reach millions, sometimes people expect precision. Gal nods. And I respect that expectation. I just think precision can coexist with humanity. Sometimes we speak in real time. We're not reading from scripts. The audience reacts with agreement. Another host jumps in to keep balance. There's also the question of how the internet reacts. Comments, clips, headlines, they can escalate quickly. Did you feel the response online crossed a line? Gal considers the wording. Some comments were constructive. Others felt personal. And that's difficult. I believe disagreement should focus on ideas, not character. Whoopi responds immediately. That's true. Attacking someone personally doesn't help the conversation. The audience applauds that. But Whoopi continues, tone steady. However, sometimes when public figures speak on sensitive topics, people respond emotionally. Not always politely, but emotionally. Do you think that's part of the reality now? Gal nods. It is part of reality. And I accept that. I just hope we can elevate how we engage with each other. The host leans in. This feels like a larger cultural moment, not just about this specific comment. It's about how public discourse works. There's a murmur of agreement in the audience. Whoopi glances at Gal. Let me ask you this. When criticism comes, do you ever feel pressure to respond immediately? Gal smiles slightly. Yes. There's pressure, but I try to pause before responding, because reacting too quickly can make things worse. The audience reacts positively to that. Whoopi gives a small approving nod. That's wisdom. Sometimes the pause matters. One of the co-hosts shifts the conversation slightly. Have you learned anything from this experience that will change how you approach future interviews? Gal answers honestly. I've learned that context matters even more than I thought, and that I need to be very clear about intention. But I won't stop having conversations because of one reaction. Applause builds again. Whoopi interjects gently. And that's important, because if every disagreement turns into avoidance, then we don't grow. The energy in the studio feels less tense now, more reflective. But the conversation isn't softening completely. It's evolving. The host turns toward Whoopi. Do you think the public sometimes expects public figures to represent one single viewpoint? Whoopi replies without hesitation. Yes, and that's unrealistic. People are complex. No one agrees with everything, even within their own communities. The audience applauds. Gal responds, looking directly at Whoopi. Exactly. I think complexity is natural, and we shouldn't reduce people to one statement. Whoopi raises her eyebrows slightly. Agreed. But when statements are made, they stand alone until explained. The audience reacts with a mix of applause and murmurs. The host quickly steps in to keep the conversation balanced. It sounds like both of you agree on more than you disagree on. Responsibility, clarity, dialogue. Gal nods. Yes. Whoopi nods as well. Yes. A small wave of laughter moves through the studio at that brief moment of alignment. But the co-host looks into the camera. And yet, the debate online continues. That's the reality. The conversation shifts toward how talk shows handle controversial discussions. Whoopi says, talk shows are supposed to allow disagreement. That's part of the format. We don't always agree at this table. Gal adds, and I appreciate that environment. It allows people to express different perspectives. The audience applauds again. One of the hosts turns back to Gal. Has this experience changed how you view public conversations overall? Yes, she replies. It reminds me that conversations are powerful. Words can unite, but they can also divide if we're not careful. Whoopi responds thoughtfully. That's true for everyone, not just celebrities. The studio grows quieter as the tone becomes reflective rather than confrontational. The host smiles slightly. Well, this is exactly why discussions like this matter. We don't always solve everything in one segment, but we model how disagreement can look in public. Applause fills the room again, steady and supportive. Gal thanks the hosts. Whoopi gives a small nod. The tension from earlier has shifted into something more grounded, not resolved, but understood. The cameras capture the moment. Two strong voices, different experiences, engaging directly without shouting, without interruption turning into chaos, just live conversation. The show moves toward the next segment, but the energy in the room suggests this discussion has resonated beyond the studio. And while the debate online will continue inside the studio, the conversation has remained focused, direct, and unmistakably live, exactly how talk television is meant to unfold. The studio has settled into a steady rhythm, but there's a noticeable seriousness in the air. The audience is attentive now, less reactive, more focused on every word. The hosts glance at their notes as the conversation continues. The main host leans in. We've talked about tone and responsibility. Let's talk about impact. When public debates like this happen, what do you think the impact is on your audience, especially younger viewers? Gal responds without hesitation. I think younger viewers are very aware. They see everything. They read comments. They watch clips. I try to remind myself that what I say can influence how they think about disagreement. Whoopi nods. That's true. Young people are watching how adults handle conflict. That includes us on this table. The audience applauds that point. One of the co-hosts turns toward Whoopi. Do you think social media makes it harder to resolve misunderstandings? Whoopi replies calmly, yes. Because conversations used to happen in full. Now they happen in fragments. A clip can go viral without the full context, and people react to the fragment. Gal adds, and once something is shared thousands of times, correcting it becomes harder than the original message. There's agreement in the room. The host asks, so what would you both suggest? How do we improve the way public conversations happen? Gal answers first. I think transparency helps. If something is unclear, we clarify it quickly. And we listen before responding emotionally. Whoopi responds, I think accountability helps. If you say something, stand by it, but also be willing to explain it. That's not weakness. That's maturity. The audience claps, some loudly. The host smiles. This is turning into a master class in disagreement. A light laugh spreads through the studio, easing the intensity. But then one of the co-hosts raises a more pointed question. Gal, Some critics online suggested that your response felt like you were distancing yourself from the original statement rather than owning it. How do you respond to that perception? The room quiets again. Gal keeps her voice steady. I understand why it might seem that way to some people. But I don't believe in defending something that wasn't my intention. If something is misunderstood, clarifying it isn't distancing, it's correcting. Whoopi interjects gently. Correction is part of communication. But sometimes people want to hear a simple, I could have worded that better. That can go a long way. Gal nods. And if my wording contributed to confusion, then I'm open to saying that. My goal is clarity, not conflict. The audience reacts with applause, this time stronger. The host leans back slightly. That's an important moment. Whoopi looks at Gal. I appreciate you saying that, because sometimes public conversations get stuck in defending instead of understanding. Gal replies, and I appreciate that this table allows space for both perspectives. The tension has shifted from confrontation to reflection, but the energy remains live, unpredictable in a way only talk television can be. Another co-host chimes in. We also have to acknowledge that audiences sometimes project their own experiences onto public figures. That can intensify reactions. Whoopi agrees. Absolutely. People relate through their own lives. That's human. Gal responds. And that's why empathy matters. Even when we disagree. The audience applauds again. The host glances at the camera. We're seeing something important happen here. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about how we communicate across differences. The studio lights hum quietly as the conversation slows slightly. Whoopi turns back to Gal. Let me ask something more personal. When you go home after a show like this, do you replay the conversation in your mind? Gal smiles gently. Sometimes. Not to criticize myself, but to think about how I can improve. I believe growth is constant. The audience reacts warmly. Whoopi nods. That's healthy, because none of us are perfect communicators. The host laughs lightly. Speak for yourself. The audience joins in, breaking the tension with humor. But the discussion isn't ending. The co-host brings it back to the core theme. At the end of the day, do you think this experience will change how people perceive you? Gal answers thoughtfully. I hope people see that I'm willing to engage. I don't avoid questions. I don't avoid dialogue. Whoopi adds, and that's what matters. You showed up. That's part of the responsibility too. There's applause. The host looks at both of them. It seems like despite the online division, this conversation has stayed respectful here. Whoopi responds, that's because we're talking, not typing. The audience laughs and claps. Gal nods. Face-to-face conversations are different. You can see intention. The atmosphere in the studio feels more grounded now. The earlier edge hasn't disappeared, but it has transformed into something constructive. The host begins to transition. When we come back, we'll talk about how public figures navigate ongoing debates after they leave the studio, and whether conversations like this actually change minds. The cameras pull back slightly as the audience applauds again. Gal remains poised, attentive. Whoopi sits comfortably, expression neutral but engaged. The conversation has not concluded. It has deepened, and in live television, sometimes that's more powerful than a dramatic ending. The break approaches, but the discussion still lingers in the room. Proof that disagreement doesn't have to escalate to remain real, and that dialogue, even tense dialogue, can stay grounded. The cameras return, and there's a noticeable anticipation in the room. The audience is settled, but the energy feels like everyone knows this is the final stretch of the conversation. The host leans forward. We're back, and we want to talk about what happens after the cameras stop rolling. Applause rises briefly. The host continues. Gal, when you leave a show like this, what do you expect to happen next? Gal responds calmly. Usually, the conversation continues online. Clips get shared. People discuss it. Sometimes the discussion reflects what we talked about here. Sometimes it doesn't. Whoopi nods. That's true for all of us. Once it's out there, it travels. The audience murmurs in agreement. The host turns to Whoopi. Do you think this kind of live exchange helps reduce misunderstandings? Whoopi answers thoughtfully. It can. When people see a full conversation instead of a short clip, they understand context better. But it depends on whether they watch the whole thing. A few laughs from the audience. Gal adds, I hope viewers see that disagreement can be respectful. We didn't avoid the topic. We discussed it directly. There's applause again. The host shifts slightly. Let's talk about the aftermath. After the show airs, What typically happens in situations like this? Gal explains there are headlines, social media reactions, commentary videos. Some people support the conversation. Others critique it. That's normal. Whoopi adds, and sometimes the reaction becomes its own story. The audience reacts with recognition. The host nods. So the cycle continues. Gal replies, yes. But I think every time we engage openly, we contribute to a healthier dialogue. Whoopi looks at her. That's the goal. There's a moment of alignment between them that the audience seems to appreciate. The host smiles. We've seen debate today, but we've also seen mutual respect. That's important. Applause fills the studio, steady and warm. The host turns toward the camera. Since this conversation aired, viewers have been sharing their opinions across social media. Some say it was a strong example of dialogue. Others say they still disagree with parts of it. That's the reality of public conversation. The audience nods. Gal says, and I respect that. People don't have to agree with me. I just hope they feel the exchange was honest. Whoopi adds, honesty doesn't require agreement. The audience applauds loudly at that line. The host begins wrapping up. What we've seen today is what live television can do. Bring different perspectives together in real time. Not scripted confrontation, not dramatic staging, but actual discussion. There's a final wave of applause. The host looks at Gal. Any final thoughts for viewers? Gal turns to the camera. I want to thank everyone who watched and participated in the conversation. I believe dialogue is essential. Even when we disagree, we can do so with respect. Applause continues. Whoopi adds her final comment. We don't have to agree on everything to sit at the same table. That's the point. The audience cheers louder now. The host smiles. And that's why shows like this exist. The camera captures the full table. Relaxed now, the earlier intensity replaced by a sense of completion. The conversation didn't end in a dramatic argument or walkout. It ended in dialogue, reflection, and acknowledgement that public discourse is complicated. As the show concludes, the audience rises in applause. Some viewers are seen discussing the exchange with each other even before leaving their seats. That immediate reaction, the mix of agreement, disagreement, and conversation, reflects exactly what happened on stage. After the broadcast, clips begin circulating online. Some viewers highlight Gal's emphasis on context and responsibility. Others focus on Whoopi's comments about tone and accountability. Social media threads fill with debate, quotes, and opinions. Talk show recap accounts break down key moments, analyzing the exchanges and encouraging viewers to watch the full segment rather than short clips. Within hours, the discussion trends across platforms, proving how quickly live television moments can expand beyond the studio walls. But inside the studio, once the cameras stop rolling, the tone remains professional. Gal thanks the hosts again off camera. Whoopi exchanges brief words of acknowledgement. There's no lingering hostility, just the reality that public conversations continue long after broadcast. And that's the takeaway from today's exchange. Disagreement can be direct without becoming destructive. Live television can host tension without turning it into chaos. Dialogue can be strong, emotional, and still respectful. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this conversation? Do you believe public figures should clarify their statements immediately, or is context often misunderstood? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.